Good afternoon, everybody. This is Marty from Dog's Blog with the noontime report of the morning session of the FrankCarson et al. Trial. Happy New Year to everybody. Today's Thursday, January 10th, 2019. Court was scheduled to get started around 9 o'clock. Judge was there about 15-20 minutes early today. And she got on the bench around 9:17 a.m. Jai Gohil addressed the court stating that he wanted to add a witness to the witness list as Dr. Lee Irvin. He's a psychologist that treated Kurt Bunch during his period sometime back when he was trying to claim a disability or something along that lines. There is a copy of his report on the last Warren Yates' last commentary. There's a copy of that report that was taken from a motion filed by Carmen Sabatino. I had purchased that motion from the clerk's office. Of course, Marlissa Ferreira took offense to that and said this is a phishing. This is inappropriate, and that she wants more information in regards to this, and she wants to know what he's going to testify to. And Jai Gohil is saying that he's only a potential witness at this point. He's not sure if he's going to call him or not. He's just putting them on notice that he possibly could be calling him. She's also asking that there's an offer of proof to his testimony being offered as an expert, and more discovery if there is some, of course. Jai Gohil said he's a psychologist, that treated Kurt Bunch, and that he is took the filing from a public document that was filed in Carmen Sabatino's motion sometime back, and the DA's office already has the information, the same information that he has. They did not argue that information in that motion at the time, but they are objecting to it now. Marlissa Ferrer claims there's HIPAA issues. That's Health Insurance Patient Privacy Act. In regards to this and Kurt Bunch's, and there's been judges in the past that have not allowed this information, unknown if it's going to be allowed here and now. Judge Aniga basically, Marlissa Ferrer went into a long rant, as she typically does these type of things, was getting worked up right off the bat. And she says there's an issue of the jury's observation of Kurt Bunch here in court, and then hearing this information. So I guess she feels that the jury's observation of Kurt Bunch in court is not good, if that's the argument that she's going to make. Judge Anigas basically said that she is familiar with this issue as it has come up in the past. It was brought up by Robert Fortner in the past, and it also was brought into play with Carmen Sabatino's motion recently, and she says basically the DA is putting the cart before the horse, because the defense attorneys are saying they're not even sure they're going to call him yet, so they'll deal with that issue as it comes along. At this time, the jury was brought up. Robert Woody was put on the stand first, and then the jury was brought up around 9:38. Bruce Perry also advised the court. Bruce Perry is Robert Woody's attorney, who's sitting in court every day. And he advised the court that he's going on vacation next week, and there will be somebody else sitting in for him, but he didn't seem to know who it was going to be at this point. Like I said, the jury was up around 9:38. Marlissa Ferreira started her directive. Robert Woody talked about she asked him about the homicide of Corey Coffin that night and what happened at Poppencork. they covered an area that actually been covered before, talking about Bobby Atwell. Robert Woody said Bobby Atwell was standing outside the gate with the truck after he'd got done burying the body, and he'd pulled the truck out. They talked about what to do next, and they went in the store and finished stocking. He just went right back to work. The store was closed, but he went back inside to stock some more shelves. He said that Daljeet Atwell was in the store closing out the register. And he said Daljeet Atwell was acting hateful and told him to keep his fucking mouth shut. Bobby Atwell came back into the store. He was still outside when he was right at the front door, but still outside when Daljeet had told him that. And then Daljeet came in and also told him to keep his mouth shut. He said he went back to nothing else was said. He went back to stocking shelves, and he did that for about 45 minutes. He said the brothers were talking behind the counter, and there was no one else there at that time, and they were talking in Punjabi, so he didn't really know what they were saying. He said it seemed that they were having a little bit of an argument, but again, talking in Punjab. He said he had told him about 3 times to keep his mouth shut, and nothing else was ever said. He said Walter Wells showed up around 45 minutes later, kind of hung out at the store for a little while as they were closing out the store. Walter Wells was not with anybody else when he came back, but he was also there earlier. Prior to them going to 9th Street, he was there with some family and drinking and hanging out at the store, and they had left. Walter Wells and his family had left prior to them going to 9th Street. He wasn't sure what time Walter Wells had gotten there earlier, or exactly what time it was when he'd shown back again after they got back. He also noted that prior to going to 9th Street, there was a couple of officers that showed up at Poppencork, as they typically just stop in there to drink, get a soda or a coffee, or take a break, or go to the bathroom or stuff. And Daljeet Atwell had left a few minutes prior to them getting the call to go to 9th Street. Robin Attenhofer was also at the store later on that night. Or she was at the store that night, and it says here prior to getting dark. So apparently she was there. She did show back up again later on. He was asked if the closed-circuit TV in the store was working, and he says it was, because Bobby Atwell checks the closed-circuit TV every morning to see what's going on during the night. When Walter Wells showed up later on that night, he talked to the Atwells behind the register. He couldn't hear what was being said. And he didn't recall earlier if Walter Wells said that he was going to come back by the store after a while, because he had left with his family members earlier. He said he never had a conversation with Walter Wells about what happened on 9th Street, and he never heard the Atwells talking to Walter Wells about 9th Street either. Walter Wells had brought his driver, what he called a drive-around car, or something to that effect, as what he brought to the store. He said Walter Wells had 3 cars. He had a truck, he had a really nice car, and then he had his just regular drive-around car, and that's what he had shown up in. Earlier, when the family was with him, they had shown up in a Cadillac, and he didn't know whose car it was, but Daljeet Atwell also had been checking the property of FrankCarson's property several times prior to that night. He said that Daljeet Atwell, knew that Daljeet Atwell was doing some checks on the property, and Daljeet Atwell had mentioned something about it previously, and this was prior to the Corey Kaufman incident. Robert Woody only knew that it was the property of a lawyer named FrankCarson. He said he had also heard the Atwells talking to some CHP officers about thefts on the property, and talked to Quintanar, McFarland, and Walter Wales about doing property and spotlight checks on the property, on FrankCarson's property. He believes that Officer Tom O'Keefe and his wife Sarah O'Keefe were involved in some of those conversations too. He said it was never mentioned who was actually doing the thefts on the property, but he said Scott McFarland had been talking about his neighbors living next door to the Atwalls, about his neighbors living next door, and the problems involved with like Corey Coffin and the Pickett family. He said that all three officers had agreed to do spotlight checks on the property. He said when Walter Wells reappeared that night after they returned from the property, he had stayed at 30 to 60 minutes. Again, he was at the front of the store the entire time talking to the Atwalls. Walter Wells then left when they were shut down the store, and everybody had left at the same time, and there was no one else there other than the four of them. They all left the store around 3:20 a.m. He said when they left the store, Daljeet told him again to keep his fucking mouth shut. And for some reason, Marlissa Farah was emphasizing the shutting down the lotto machine in the store, and he didn't see anybody shut it down. For some reason, Marlissa Farah kept asking the question in different ways to get a different response than what he was giving. Finally, he said that Daljeet had closed the lotto machine down, and there was also several objections and sustained by the judge, and actually a slight admonishment by the judge where she was asking leading questions because she's trying to get certain answers, and she's not getting those certain answers out of Woody. And so she kept asking leading questions and then gets objected to, and then she asks the question again, and she's already given the answer that she's looking for. Robert Woody did not recall having a phone that night. He also noted, too, right about that time, that he has trouble remembering dates and times. And he didn't have a phone with him that night, and he was unknown if anyone else had a phone that night either. He did not recall any conversations between the Atwalls and if they had phones either. He did say they're making calls all the time when they're at work. And he said when Baljeet Atwell called the store, he would either call Dee on his personal phone or call the store phone, the landline at the store. It runs either way. He didn't seem to have any preference. Robert Woody never heard any phones ring prior to them, Daljeet and Robert Woody, leaving the store that night when he said they got a call from Baljeet. He said Baljeet had the pickup and Daljeet had his car. He didn't say what kind of car it was. He said when they went home at 3:20 that night, he said Beverly Woody was awake in her room, and he had gone in to talk to her about what had gone on. And he said no one else was present. And she asked what he told Beverly Woody, and there was objections. Again, a sidebar, and she came back and asked a little bit different question. A lot different question. She asked him was if he had been drinking that night or used any methamphetamine or any other drug that night. He said no, he had not. The jury was sent out at 10:37 for a break, and when the jury was out, the judge asking Marlissa where she's going with these questionings. She's really not sure. And she's not sure about the relevance of what she's asking. And she said she was leading up to the body wires and recordings with Miranda Dykes, and so we got started again around 11:04. Robert Woody said he had told. She asked who he had told about what had happened. He said he told Beverly Woody, Robert Attenhofer, which was his girlfriend at the time. She had since passed away. He had eventually had told Brian Coates, his nephew, Robert Lee Woody, his son. They had told them some tidbits, and so there was not told. He said he didn't tell them everything, but some tidbits. He said Miranda Dykes had come along a little bit later. This is after Robin Attenheimer had passed away. Attenhofer had passed away. Miranda Dykes had come along. She was a girlfriend for a time. This was after the Corey Kaufman disappearance, when he talked to Miranda Dykes in the infamous body wire. And he said also Robert Bronco was involved in that conversation. That was his sister's son. The next day, he worked at the store. He got there before noon. This is after the incident, he said, with Corey Kaufman. He got to the store before noon. Bobby and Dee were both there. Unknown when they opened the store, there was no conversation with anyone in regards to the previous night. There were no other workers there that day. She asked him about the lighting on the side lot of the store. He said it's poor lighting on the side at night. He did not notice any neighbors with any lights on in the area that overlooked that lot. He said the dogs are always barking, and he said there were some dogs yapping that night. He saw no one else on the side lot that night, and he never had any conversations the next night after that about what happened. He said he just tried to keep his mouth shut and he didn't want to bring it up. Marlissa Ferrer was asking about the gun that was used on Corey Hoffman. He didn't know what had happened to it. He really wasn't familiar with the gun that much. He never saw the gun again afterwards, and he said he never asked. Balji had left the store that night. He saw him grab a gun from the counter, under the counter area, and put it in his left pocket. It was like a jacket pocket or something. He'd never seen the gun before. He didn't really tell if it was a revolver or a semi-auto, but he thought it was a revolver. And the gun was never discussed or seen prior to that night. And he doesn't, like I said, he didn't know what had happened to that gun afterwards. The next day after the incident with Corey Kaufman, he didn't see Walter Wells at the store. He worked from noon until closing, so they worked apparently about 12 hours or so or more. And Daljeet was there, and mostly in the night shift. Baljeet was there. Daljeet had actually opened the store at noon, and Baljeet showed up a little bit later, is what he said. He was asked about if they're making calls. He said they're always making calls when they're working. They always have a lot of things going on. He was asked if he ever was present when FrankCarson was on the phone. He said he was not aware of it if it was. He was asked him if they had referred to FrankCarson as Uncle Frank. And he said that was just like a term that they used for him. And he said Baljeet Atwell was not his usual self the next day. Baljeet Atwell appeared upset. He said law enforcement officers did come into the store that next day. Quentin R. McFarland and some Turlock Police Department officers had come in. While the body was out on the side lot, there was no parties or barbecues or anything out in that lot, which is they had on occasion. But during the time that Corey Kaufman was there, he said there was no activities that went on out there. The Outlaw said they didn't want anybody out there and told him to keep the gates shut at all times. He was asked if there was any injuries on Daljeet, on either Atwell brother, if there was any injuries. He did not recall initially, but he did tell the law enforcement officers he saw an injury to Daljeet Atwell's hand during one of his interviews. Said he saw the injury the next day. The right hand was swollen. There was no injuries to Baljeet Atwell. Daljeet had an ace bandage or something wrapped around his hand. This is again after Marlissa Ferrer was She didn't hear the answers that she was looking for as far as injuries, and she started asking leading questions again about an injury, and then he started recalling that injury, and again was admonished slightly by the judge in regards to that. He said the CHP officers had come in. Scott McFarland and Quentin Narr had asked Dalgy about what had happened to his hand. He said he was riding a motorcycle and he'd hit a spot of oil or something, had gone down, and he'd received just a slight injury or sprain or something to his hand. So they got to a point around 20 days later. He said that Baljeet Atwal said he didn't want the body there anymore, and they decided to move the body to the mountains with no explanations for. Actually, Baljeet Atwal wasn't telling him anything. He said they're going to move the body, and he had him dig up the body. And he said he didn't ask either. He didn't want to know. He dug up the body. Took him 10 minutes to dig up the body. They put the body in the back of the truck, and it was while they were loading up the body in the truck, Robin Attenhofer had walked down from the store and walked down to the store and saw them loading it up and started asking a lot of questions. He had to tell her what happened. She went with them to the mountains where he says they disposed of the body. He said there was a foul smell when he had dug up the body and they were putting it in the truck. He and Bobby Atwal had both grabbed each end of the tarp. The tarp was never opened up again, but they could smell it, of course. And the tarp was tarp with the body was placed in the back of the pickup. They got in the vehicle with Robin Attenhofer, and Bobby Atwal drove. He had no idea where they were going. Robin Attenhofer had her phone on her. He did not know if Baljeet Atwal did or not. Baljeet Atwal stayed at the store and it was still open. They drove to the mountains. It took us some time to get there. He was not familiar with any of the towns that they had passed. They had passed a few towns, but he was not familiar with any of the names. There was no conversation during the drive. They never asked where. He never asked where they were going, and Baljeet Atwal had never said where they were going. He did not recall if Bobby Atwal had ever went to the mountains prior to that, and he said he drove to an hour. They drove about an hour to an hour and a half. They did not make any stops on the way. In the mountains, the roads turned from asphalt to gravel and dirt to mostly just dirt, and they stopped on a dirt road by a campground. They'd gone down by the campground, made a U-turn, come back, and parked on the side of the road, and that's where they had disposed of the body. He saw no one else on the road or at the campsite during this whole thing. There's more to come. That was where we broke for lunch. Robert Woody's going to be on the stand on direct probably the rest of today, and my guess is probably into several days into next week. So we'll be back at 1:30 this afternoon, and don't forget the podcast tonight.